Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Brewmaster Monk in Dragonflight. Brewmaster Monks are super fast-paced, high-damage tanks. They are one of the harder bursting AoE damage specs in the game, too. They have an absurdly long list of offensive and defensive cooldowns, and their rotation is pretty complex for a tank. Their defensive toolkit is really good at dealing with burst damage, which makes them incredibly well suited for tanking and raids. Their limited self-healing can be an issue in Mythic Plus, but it has just been buffed within the last 24 hours of me recording this, and monks have more self-healing available in Season 1 of Dragonflight than at any point during the 9 years from their introduction with Mists of Pandaria until the 4-piece tier set bonus was added to the game in Season 3 of Shadowlands. Brewmasters are really strong tanks if you can manage their enormous, complex toolkit, but they are pretty unforgiving while you're still learning, and because it's so complex, there's a lot to learn. Brewmaster Monks are really good at living through burst damage. They're good at dealing damage, and they're good at mobility. They are not good at self-healing. This is their biggest weakness. They're pretty dependent on their healers to keep their health pools up. They have good damage mitigation cooldowns, and they smooth out damage intake very effectively, but they will take more damage than other tanks, and that means they need more healing than other tanks. They multiply incoming healing thanks to Celestial Fortune, so this isn't a problem in raids, but in Mythic Plus, it can be. Brewmaster's tier set bonuses are simple, but pretty effective. The 2-piece bonus grants you a 1% damage and damage reduction effect for 15 seconds when you use Tiger Palmer's Spinning Crane Kick, and it stacks up to 4 times. I realize that it is worded in a way that basically just openly states it would stack multiple times from a single Spinning Crane Kick cast, but it doesn't do that. You have to cast it 4 times to get 4 stacks of the buff. The 4-piece bonus makes Purifying Brew remove 3% more stagger damage per stack of the 2-piece. This interacts with all of the talents that work with Stagger and Purify as well, like Guy Plin's Imperial Brew and Improved Nizao. These are good bonuses. They're simple. The 2-piece is a little annoying to stack up at the start of polls because you don't want to just sit there and Spinning Crane Kick 4 times in a row, so it might take 10 or 15 seconds to get fully stacked up, but once it's up, it's easy to maintain. And the 4-piece adds a lot of defensive value. The 2-piece grants right about what you would hope for in terms of offense and defense for a 2-piece, 4% damage and damage reduction. Good set, not mind-blowing, pretty simple, but it doesn't feel mandatory or rotation changing in a way that makes you feel bad for not having it. It's just a nice little bonus that's good to have, and you can live without it. Now let's talk about talents, and I have 2 main talent setups to consider here, a dungeon setup and a raid setup. Alright, I have 2 talent builds here. This first one that I'm going to be showing off is the Mythic Plus build. As you can see over here in the left tree, I have a couple of talents that I have added and notably omitted, like Improved Roll here, which is a talent that I really like. I don't think is absolutely critical in Mythic Plus, especially if you're running Celerity. You still have 2 roll charges and they're on a 15-second cooldown, so I mean that's technically more baseline mobility than you've had in Mythic Plus for years. But if you prefer Chi Torpedo, then you can absolutely pick up Improved Roll. You probably would want to give up another talent like, I think Hasty Provocation probably makes the most sense. It's probably the least necessary talent in Mythic Plus. The main reason that you're a little squished for points, and giving up Improved Roll is that you're wanting to take Vigorous Expulsion, Grace of the Crane, and Profound Rebuttal, all 4 of these talent points that you're putting into these 3 talents, just greatly increase your healing. Your self-healing done with Expel Harm out of these 2 talents, and then also just your healing taken by 8%. Pretty great. You could come down here and take Close to Heart as well. That's another 8% healing taken, but to get to that, you actually do have to start giving up a pretty significant amount of defensive value somewhere else. You would have to give up Bounce Back, which is sort of a reactive defensive cooldown. This isn't a particularly useful talent while leveling, so if you were leveling, I would probably run a build that doesn't have nearly this much emphasis on your self-healing. You know, if I was going to level as a Brewmaster, I'd probably accept the fact that I'm a tank, so I'm already not going to be taking that much damage. Cut out bounce back, cut out those leveling, you know, healing talents, and emphasize more like mobility talents. Just stick to the damage stuff. And then as I progressed through leveling, you know, this would be kind of the starting point, and then probably pick up some of the healing talents as I went along. You can also drop this point in Hasty Provocation to pick up Detox, depending on what dungeon you're doing. If there's any poison or disease dispels that you need to do and you don't have anybody else in your group to do them, that is a sacrifice you can make for the good of the group. Over here in the right tree, you know, there are some optional talents here. You basically have 2 floating points. You have Bountiful Brew and Blackout Combo are a couple of floating point options. These weren't like amazing talents through most of the beta. Pretense of Instability, this talent over here in sort of the bottom right of the tree, was recently buffed very hard. Prior to a couple of days ago, prior to the buff, it was 10% dodge for 3 seconds every time you would drink a brew, or really only a purifying or celestial brew. And you drink one of those maybe every 10 to 12 seconds, so relatively low uptime, like 25% uptime on a 10% dodge buff, just not that great. And then they buffed it out to 5 seconds and made it 15% dodge, and so if you spec into Blackout Combo and then empower all of your keg smashes so you get more brews up, and you run Bountiful Brew so you're getting more brew availability, now you're probably using brews more like every 9 seconds or so, 9 to 10. Being conservative estimate there, and so that's quite a lot more dodge than it was before. It basically has tripled in value, and an average of like 7.5–8% dodge for one talent. Well, you know, maybe more than that thanks to the empowerment from Blackout Combo and the value of Bountiful Brew. That's a pretty good trade. Certainly helps a lot in Mythic Plus for reducing your damage taken from auto attacks, which is something that monks actually struggle with. If you don't want to deal with the active component of Blackout Combo, you could go with High Tolerance. I mean, if you don't want the RNG of Bountiful Brew, you could also go with High Tolerance. It's a little bit more reliable at the expense of, frankly, just not being as good as the other 2 talent points, but this is an option as well, picking up High Tolerance. You could also take one of these points and throw it into Healing Elixir, and then now you have yourself a kind of low potency, but, you know, a heal that you can use, and that's something. It's helpful, certainly better than not having a heal. You could also throw a point in Clash if you would really like to have sort of some, like, more CC utility. The ability to root enemies at range helps a lot with kiting. That is also an option. Critical talents, though, you definitely want to take Storm Stout's Last Keg, Exploding Keg. You want to have Bone Dust Brew and Weapons of Order. You could drop Chi Surge. That is a kind of a decent sized damage loss, and if you're playing a Brewmaster Monk, you really do want to be maximizing your damage, so I don't highly recommend it, but it's an option. Shadowboxing Treads gives you a ton more offensive and defensive value out of Blackout Kick. It makes it deal, you know, 20% more damage, but it also makes it hit 3 targets, or up to 3 targets instead of just the 1, and each target you hit generates a stack of Mastery, so it's a pretty substantial increase. They also generate a stack of Hit Scheme, increasing your Keg Smash by 10% per stack. So just a lot of value added out of this one very simple looking talent. Offensive value and defensive value. All right, now let's take a look at the raid setup, which is obviously very similar. Basically nothing has changed over in this right tree. Again, I think you can get away with dropping Bountiful Brew and Blackout Combo if you just don't feel like using them, and taking High Tolerance will make you even better at mitigating boss burst damage, which is what you always want to be doing on a monk. So this is absolutely an option. There are some other potential damage first talent builds you could go with, like taking Facepalm and Counter-Strike. And then we'll have to move some talents around here a little bit. Basically forgoing this entire elusive footwork setup and going over toward improved Invoke Nizao. You would probably need to give up Pretense of Instability to be able to afford that, but here you go. This would be a little bit more like the Invoke Nizal playstyle that was in vogue for maxing your damage in Shadowlands. Now, this required some degenerate gameplay to be able to maximize your damage. You basically had to intentionally take more damage than a fight was supposed to deal to you, you know, taking Rygalon for long periods of time. So you would take more damage, be able to purify more damage, and then your Nizal would stomp for more. Generally, this is kind of dumb, and having tested and played around with this in raid testing, I did not really find that there was a lot of opportunity to actually make use of this and get a DPS increase compared to just doing the more standard intended play style of stacking up your weapons of order and layering Bone Dust Brew and using potion and trinket and then hitting enemies with a big ol' exploding keg. I actually found that trying to maximize Nizal value and all really didn't actually have a positive effect. I think I lost damage trying to worry about that. So for me, regular build it is. And this is going to be a lot more tanky anyways, so everybody kind of comes out happier that way. One final little optional thing here, Rushing Jadewind versus Special Delivery. Rushing Jadewind, if you're able to maintain it all the time, which is, you know, pretty easy to do, you have a couple of extra seconds of duration over the cooldown. You see, like I hit it here, 6-second cooldown, and duration still going. Duration is still got 2.5 seconds left on it, cooldown had finished. So on its own, it's really not like that great. I think it actually is less damage than Special Delivery if you're just comparing them in a vacuum, because Special Delivery doesn't require any GCDs. It's just basically a passive damage increase whenever you drink brews. And it scales nicely with Blackout Combo and Bountiful Brew and Pretense of Instability and all of that stuff. So it seems like it would be good. But it has an interaction over here with Resonant Fists. This ability or passive talent in the class tree that just says your attacks have a chance to resonate, dealing, 3,000-ish damage to enemies within 8 yards. It is an AoE, and it is a 1-second internal cooldown, and it's just a 15% proc chance. So by having Rushing Jadewind active, you're just ticking an attack hit every half second on everything that's near you all the time, in addition to everything else you have going on, your auto attacks, all of your other spells that you're casting, dot ticks, whatever else. This basically just adds a big old damage multiplier into the rest of your rotation. You're just triggering way more Resonant Fists procs by using Rushing Jadewind. So in my experience and in my comfort preference, I do like Rushing Jadewind more, although I think that Special Delivery is absolutely an option if you want something a little less involved, a little easier to play. It certainly is that, and it does very comparable damage, and it has more utility because it gives you a 50% move speed slow. All right, I think that's about it. Okay, now let's move on to abilities. Keg Smash, Rising Sun Kick, Blackout Kick, and Breath of Fire are your core rotational skills, and you want to try to maximize your usage of them once you've made use of your offensive cooldowns. Using your cooldowns can be a bit complicated. The main rule of thumb for managing offensive cooldowns, and your rotation in general, is just to not let your abilities sit on cooldown. You obviously can't cast all of them at once, a global cooldown makes sure of that, so prioritizing them correctly is important, but if you manage to use, all of your abilities as much as you can, you're off to a great start. You have a ton of offensive cooldowns, but Touch of Death is the only one that has any sort of special usage requirement. The enemy's health needs to be low. You can use the rest of them whenever you like. Whenever possible, you should try to overlap them with each other so that they multiply each other's effect. This will make them do a lot more damage. For example, an exploding keg that you just throw at an enemy at random might do 30,000 damage. That's not bad, but if you popped an agility potion, used a stat trinket, put Bone Dust Brew, got Weapons of Order up, and applied 4 stacks to the target first, you could get more than twice as much damage, potentially 3 times more if Bone Dust Brew procs. This means you kind of have to think a bit like a damage dealer when you're using your cooldowns, which is a pretty fun change of pace for a tank. Now let's go over your main defensive skills. You have Celestial Brew, which is a big absorb shield. In raids, you should be using this whenever you need to mitigate big, predictable burst damage hits from bosses. During Trash or in Mythic Plus, you generally just want to use it whenever you take lots of damage and need to protect your health pool from hitting 0, basically. Purifying Brew is the most commonly used defensive skill in your toolkit. It reduces your incoming damage. You can sort of think of it as kind of a damage reduction skill that you use whenever your stagger value gets too high. This tends to overlap with taking lots of damage, so basically, if you're taking a lot of damage, you're also going to be staggering a lot of damage. You stagger damage whenever you take damage, so it sort of makes sense. Using Purifying Brew is kind of a thing you develop a feel for the more you play Brewmaster Monk. It's probably the question that players ask about the most when they're starting out, but because you only remove 50% of the stagger you have going, it's something you actually don't need to micromanage that much. There's a pretty significant amount of diminishing return in using Purifying Brew several times in a row very quickly. If you're just staggering your Purify casts out a bit, if you every 8 to 10 seconds you hit Purifying Brew, under normal tanking circumstances, that gets the job done. Hitting Purify anytime you suddenly take a lot of damage is a good idea. That's pretty much the rules of thumb when you're learning to play Brewmaster Monk is every 8 to 10 seconds or so, if you take a big chunk of damage, hit Purify, and you should be pretty much good to go. Expel Harm is your main self-heal. If you're playing super defensively and tanking a lot of damage, you can basically use it on cooldown. Otherwise, you tend to want to basically just use it when you feel that you need healing. The same more or less goes for healing elixirs if you're talented into that. Now let's talk about defensive cooldowns. You have Fortifying Brew, Dampen Harm, Diffuse Magic, and Zen Meditation. You can also count Celestial Brew as a cooldown too, I think, but I've already talked about that one. Those cooldowns you have are all pretty useful. You can use Fortifying Brew and Dampen Harm pretty much just as general purpose defensive cooldowns. They're good for everything. Diffuse Magic is only useful for magic damage, but it's very strong, and the cooldown is pretty short for how good it is. 90 seconds is pretty impressive. And finally, Zen Meditation is the weakest and hardest to use cooldown of that set in general applications, but it can be really good for mitigating some damage events that are a little more telegraphed. You know, a boss is throwing a 1.5 second or 2 second cast into you, and it's not like a series of ticks, like it hits you at the end. It's off the GCD, so you can get a hit in, and then in that last half second, you hit Zen Meditation, and now that big slam that the boss was going to do did 60% less damage. Pretty good. It's not a skill that you want to sit in, though, because you aren't able to dodge or parry any attacks while you're channeling, so you're guaranteed to get hit by the next auto attack that comes in. Even if you're spec'd into Fundamental Observation, the talent that makes it so that it won't break when you're auto-attacked, it's still usually not a good defensive cooldown in situations where you would just be getting auto-attacked. You should be doing stuff like generating brew cooldown and mastery stacks and maintaining stagger and purifying and so on, not just floating around and getting auto-attacked. So Zen Med is really only about mitigating very big predictable boss spell casts, but it is extremely good for that one purpose. I didn't really mention Brewmaster mobility. It's incredibly straightforward. It's incredibly good too. You have Tiger's Lust as a slow removal and sprint. You have roll. It's roll. You have Transcendence, which can be really powerful for navigating back and forth across a room in the blink of an eye. But, other than that, it's a pretty straightforward mobility toolkit, You got a move speed increase, and you've got roll. It's great. Now let's talk about how to pull on a Brewmaster Monk. This is something I very specifically wanted to talk about on all of the tanks, because I know that pulling packs of mobs in dungeons can be kind of challenging for newer players. So here we are. If you're running Rushing Jadewind, and this is why I prefer Rushing Jadewind to Special Delivery, you want to precast it before you run into the pack. That just gives you some free extra damage and threat. Keg Smash should be the first damaging skill that you use on a pack of enemies once you're in range. If you have Bone Dust Brew, you can cast it as you're getting close, but be careful if it's a pack that's a little spread out. Bone Dust Brew is on the global cooldown, and it doesn't do any damage or generate threat, so you kind of put yourself a little bit behind the 8 ball if you open with that, because it'll pull stuff in, but then other people will deal damage and healing, and mobs will scatter around. You're usually better off tagging all the mobs in a pull with a damaging skill like Keg Smash and then spinning Crane Kick, then using Bone Dust Brew once they're gathered up, and then proceeding with your rotation from there. You will want to use Bone Dust Brew and Weapons of Order early on in pretty much any pull that's going to last long enough for you to get their value out of them, and once the enemy is debuffed with those, you want to hit them with an Exploding Keg for a huge burst of damage, and then you'll have threat completely locked up. After this point, you can just unload the rest of your offensive cooldowns and pretty much proceed into your normal rotation. Getting Keg Smash and Breath of Fire early in a pull is important just to ensure that you lock up threat and have your active mitigation rolling. Then you can blast your cooldowns and you should be good to go. Alright, in terms of stats, monks want to enchant and gem for versatility, and then crit is your second best secondary stat. Agility is your most valuable stat, so whenever possible you just want to maximize your item level. Like if probably the most commonly asked question across all videos, should I wear this piece of gear or this one? If they're the same item level, versatility and crit are more important, but if they're different item levels and it's not a trinket, you pretty much want to wear the one that's higher item level. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.